In the last 6 hours, Adnan Syed, whose case was on Serial, granted new trial. In the last 8 hours, Serial podcasts Adnan Syed granted new trial. Killer made famous in Serial podcast granted new trial earlier today. There is J. Wilds. The Adnan Syed saga isn't over yet. Serial, Adnan Syed gets new trial. Serial, subject Adnan Syed will get new trial in Classmates slang news. Rep. Russia expels diplomats in reprisal against U.S. and others. Video, Serial podcasts Adnan gets new murder trial. Adnan Syed, subject of Serial podcast, granted a new trial yesterday. Serial podcasts Adnan gets new trial. Adnan Syed, subject of hit Serial podcast, getting a new trial. Adnan Syed of Serial is getting a new trial. Adnan Syed from Serial podcast is even closer to new trial. U.S. court orders new trial for Serial podcast inmate killer profiled in Serial podcast, granted new trial. Adnan Syed from Serial is getting a new trial. He's one of the lucky few. U.S. appeals court upholds new trial for Serial podcast subject Adnan Syed. Adnan Syed's murder conviction tossed. Serial's Adnan Syed granted retrial by Maryland court. Serial's Adnan Syed to get new murder trial. Serial subject Adnan Syed deserving of new trial, says appeals court. Serial saga continues as Adnan is granted new trial. Serial's Adnan Syed has been granted a new trial. Serial podcast subject Adnan Syed is granted a retrial. Serial podcast Syed granted a new trial after winning appeal. Adnan Syed of Serial podcast fame granted new trial. Adnan Syed was just granted a new trial partly because of Serial. Adnan Syed wins right to new trial based on alibi evidence. Adnan Syed, made famous in the podcast Serial, is getting a new trial. Appeals court upholds new trial for Serial's Adnan Syed. Maryland appeals court upholds Adnan Syed's overturned conviction. Baltimore man highlighted in Serial to get new murder trial. Will Adnan Syed get a new trial? This story isn't over yet. Adnan Syed of Serial will get a new trial. Serial podcast subject Adnan Syed to get new trial. Adnan Syed, subject of Serial, granted new trial. Appeals court orders new trial for Serial's Adnan Syed. Court upholds decision overturning Serial subject's conviction. Court rules Adnan Syed of Serial podcast has the right to a new trial. Adnan Syed wins appeal for new trial in murder case made famous by Serial. Adnan Syed from Serial is getting a new trial. Maryland court grants new trial to Serial podcast subject Adnan Syed. Adnan Syed of Serial will get a new trial. Maryland court affirms. Maryland court upholds new trial for man in Serial podcast. Serial subject Adnan Syed deserves a new trial. Appeals court rules U.S. Serial's Adnan Syed granted new trial in murder case. Adnan Syed, subject of Serial podcast, granted new trial. Serial subject Adnan Syed is getting a new trial. Adnan Syed of Serial is granted a new trial. Adnan Syed of Serial podcast will get a new trial. Serial podcast subject Adnan Syed granted new trial by MD appeals court. Convicted or profiled in Serial podcast granted new trial. Serial subject Adnan Syed will get a new trial in appeals court has ruled Adnan Syed from Serial should get a new trial. Appeals court upholds new trial for subject of Serial podcast after Serial podcast convicted murderer gets new U.S. trial. Serial subject Adnan Syed granted new trial. Maryland appeals court upholds new trial for subject of Serial subject of Serial podcast to get new trial on all charges. Adnan Syed will get a new trial. Court of Special Appeals upholds ruling granting Adnan Syed new trial. Appeals judges Adnan Syed entitled to new trial. Adnan Syed of Serial granted new trial. Serial's Adnan Syed wins appeal. Court upholds decision granting new trial for Serial's Adnan Syed. Maryland appeals court orders new trial in Serial murder case. Adnan Syed of Serial podcast to face new trial. Serial podcast subject Adnan Syed granted new trial.